Thank you all for being here tonight. We are so pleased to be able to bring you this program with Tom Schroeder on the history of his renovation of Waldmann's. And just as a reminder, this program will be recorded and available on our YouTube channel within just a few days. So please consider supporting the Ramsey County Historical Society. We rely on the support of members and friends like you to continue to present these programs and all of our efforts. And for those of you that are members, you know that there are some great benefits to joining, including our quarterly magazine, Ramsey County History. And you also get free admission to our historic site, Gibbs Farm, up in Larpenteur in Cleveland, which fortunately, and we're so happy to be able to open up again this summer after being closed last summer. So you can find out more about RCHS, including upcoming programs, all about the wonderful things we have coming up at Gibbs Farm, including a program with the Minnesota Sinfonia coming up on our website. The address is on the screen, rchs.com. And we've got some wonderful programs coming up in July, including programs for adults and kids. I also want to urge you to check out Waldmann Brewery's website, waldmannbrewery.com. It's also on the slide on your screen, and check out what they have coming up. And please feel free to visit over there. It's a great place. They've got great beer and great food. So I'll turn it over to Tom in just a minute, but we want to acknowledge the sacred Dakota land. Minnesota Mekoche, the land where the waters are so clear they reflect the clouds, is the ancestral and contemporary homeland of the Dakota people. It is also home to the Anishinaabe and other indigenous peoples. The Ramsey County Historical Society acknowledges that its sites are located on and benefit from these sacred Dakota lands. Ramsey County Historical Society is committed to preserving our past, informing our present, and inspiring our future. Part of doing so is acknowledging the painful history and current challenges facing the Dakota people, just as we celebrate the contributions of the Dakota and other indigenous peoples. You can find our full land acknowledgement statement on our website, again, rchs.com, and that includes actionable ways in which Ramsey County Historical Society pledges to honor the Dakota and other indigenous peoples of Minnesota Mekoche, including interpretive stories at Gibbs Farm. So again, we are committed to bring you the stories and histories of all in our community, and we are so pleased to bring you tonight's program as part of our June coverage of restoration and research. And I'm so pleased to be able to turn this over to Tom Schroeder to tell you the story of Waldmann's Brewery. Thanks, Tom.
It's an honor and a pleasure to be with all of you tonight. And my only regret is that you couldn't be here live at Waldmann with me. I'm speaking to you live from the upstairs offices, if you can call them that. Behind me, you'll see a live stream of what's actually going on down in the beer garden, where Dan Chenard and Laura McKenzie and Gary Rue are playing to an audience of about 75 people. And historically, we have had a wonderful partnership with RCHS to provide many of these presentations here at Waldmann in our Buffalo room. And I look forward very much to hosting those with Robin again this fall when everybody's prepared to come back. I also just want to acknowledge that I'm shocked and pleasantly surprised to see a number of good friends and mentors participating in the Zoom tonight. Don, shout out to you, and Bob and Emily. A number of you have been, in fact, extremely instrumental in the story I'm about to tell, the restoration of St. Paul's oldest surviving commercial building and only surviving Civil War saloon. And I thank you for not just your help and inspiration on Waldmann, but in fact, in Don's case, literally introducing me to this neighborhood. So shout out to you in particular. And let me just give maybe a bit of a trigger warning. If there are any current or former HPC members in this presentation or officials of the city of St. Paul, none of my remarks are intended to offend. I'm just going to share in a very personal way my own experiences in this project. The good, the bad, the ugly. I build this as a kiss and tell, and I'm going to deliver on that. But at the end of the day, we all ultimately came together to make this happen. And this is what we'll be describing in a minute here. I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully you can all see the title slide, Waldmann Reviving an 1850s Lager Beer Saloon, some do's and don'ts here. Well, so how did this all start? It all started with this humble, unprepossessing building, which is awkwardly situated right on the lot line of Smith Avenue between West 7th Street and St. Paul's High Bridge, with some bizarre looking scabs, if you can call them that, between the first and the second level. There's a smear of concrete or stucco. It appears to be sort of a vernacular Federalist style building, and yet look at that front entrance door. It's asymmetrically located below and to the left of the windows above. And what about that rather clear line? If you look on the first level of this building in the front facade, there's kind of a yellowish tinge of limestone, but then there's a line where it goes gray just before you get to the right edge of the building. It looks as though something has happened to this building, but we don't know quite what has happened. If we're looking at this in 2008, when I first purchased this building, the only writings on this structure describe it as the Anthony Waldmann House. There's very little other research. The research that's been done variously incorrectly describes Waldmann as living in the house, selling grain from the house, a grain merchant in downtown. But there's little other history done of Anthony, yet alone of his wife Wilhelmina. And then to the left of the building, which you can't see fully in the frame, are a couple of other little cottages, the first of which is only 5 feet away from the stone building. And there's really very little understanding of their history or past. One, in fact, is entirely abandoned. It's been abandoned for nearly a decade and is a bit of a sore spot in the neighborhood in 2008 because of all the police calls and the mishaps that have occurred. The other is lived in by an owner who's very caring, very quiet, and knows little of the history of his building either. But what happens in May of 2008, and I, by the way, live just 200 feet from this structure down the alley in a house that faces McBowl Street. What happens is suddenly the lights go dark. The trash piles up, windows become broken, the house becomes vandalized, and ultimately, by the end of that year, there are placards on the building labeling it a level 3 vacant structure, which in city parlance means on a conveyor belt to potential demolition if full code compliance isn't achieved within a certain very narrow time frame. And I go to work. I had seen this building first in 1992, more than a decade earlier when I first moved into the neighborhood. And I didn't just move into the neighborhood, I moved into another small limestone structure. My wife and I, in fact, that was the first house we lived in Upper Town, after touring yet a third limestone structure that first drew us to the neighborhood. That structure was once owned by Don Empson, who's participating in the Zoom call tonight. What is it with all of these limestone buildings in Upper Town, you might ask? I didn't know at the time, but I was sure curious. And so I bought this building from the son of the owner who had died in the house, thus the vacancy. And for an amount that the owner pushed across the table and said, I won't sell it unless you take it for $10,000 less. The most bizarre negotiation I've ever had in my life. But they trusted that we meant well by the structure. We had already expressed our intent to restore it after a full research of its history, and we were off and running. Well, what about that history? That brings me to my first do's and don'ts. Number one, when you're restoring an 1850s lager beer saloon, do your research. Who is Anton Waldmann really? I spent 2.5 years at the Minnesota Historical Society, where I met others on this call, such as Bob Frame and Emily, doing their devoted research on various other historic projects, digging into the life of this man. And unfortunately, as is the case with most common people of the mid-19th century in North America, they don't leave very many traces. Scraps here and there in the city directory. You've got the decennial censuses. You later on get blue books. You've got lots of property records. But about those property records, what came to pass was a discovery of a vast store of resources at the Ramsey County land records, where it turns out people stored a huge quantity of unrelated records unrelated to real estate. In fact, records relating to contracts, to wills, plat maps, early development drawings, all sorts of things. Here you have a license, and it happens to be a saloon license from 1856 by Francis Amon, the owner of a lager beer saloon in downtown St. Paul at the time. And the license states that Francis will operate the saloon in compliance with all laws and regulations. He won't allow dancing or gambling or, God forbid, billiards. But I spent months, including under the tutelage of Jim Szewicz, another neighbor who's aided tremendously in this project, learning all of the resources in Ramsey County records, which were voluminous and which hardly anyone else who caretakes those records knows anything about. And what I discovered in that process was Anthony Waldmann, in fact, was a saloon keeper. This particular jotting is not from the Ramsey County property records, but in fact is from the State Historic Archives, the council proceedings of the city of St. Paul, a record handwritten in March 23rd of 1858, where Anton Waldmann, veritably hat in hand, went to the city to seek a petition, to seek a license to sell liquors. And not just any liquors, but in fact, as I later found out, lagers. More on that history in a moment. And you see on March 23rd, Anton, together with another concern by the name of Hugh and Mills, turns out another saloon owner, were granted a license at the rate of $50 per annum. Anton was granted the license apparently retroactively because he had already begun operations in October of the prior year, October of 1857. In other words, he was caught. And the licensure was imposed on him retroactively to his actual opening date, a phenomenon that turns out to have been very common in this period. St. Paul had over 135 operating saloons officially on the rolls by 1860, possibly double that in an unlicensed format. I got possessed by these records. I was fascinated by this particular business model and the impact it had on the early growth of the city. St. Paul in the 1850s and up until the panic of 1857 had sort of a fairground atmosphere with hundreds of not just saloons, but other small enterprises operating frequently out of wood shanties, helter-skelter throughout platted and unplatted areas of the city. And the real estate speculation was so feverish. In this particular record from Ramsey County Records, Sarah Lee of Hemingsburg, Kentucky, leases through her attorney, in fact, the National Saloon that was previously, leases it to Frederick Poole. She was the previous operator through operators on site for a term of 1 year for a sum of $960 with all of these objects in the saloon. So this is a turnkey lease of a saloon for nearly $1,000 a year. That is a huge sum of money. I will tell you that this structure, depending on its construction, could have likely have been built for less than that money. But the value of the real estate and the value of this business as a going concern in the 1850s, together with the real estate speculation, made this an absolute cash cow. If you're entering into a lease for $1,000 a year, in current standards, you're probably earning 3 to 4 times that in cash flow. So this was a rich, rich time period for saloons in St. Paul. And this is dated April 6th, 1858, nearly 7 months after the panic commenced. Well, here's a map of the city of St. Paul, and just to orient you to where these saloons were and where ultimately Waldmann chose as the site for his saloon. This happens to be the Prince map of 1852. Notice the helter-skelter layout of the various platted areas of the city. I don't know if you can all see my cursor, but I'm circling around Leach's Addition on the extreme western edge of the then developed area of the city of St. Paul. It appears to be askew, but in fact, it's the only addition that has a perfect north-south orientation at this point in time. And the streets don't line up because of that north-south orientation with any of the other platted streets in the city of St. Paul. More on that in a moment. But let's look at some of the saloons I found in researching Waldmann. Because when you're researching a particular saloon, you run across 1,000 other things you don't intend to, and not just saloons, but I won't go there. Nicholas Potgeiser operated for 2 generations the Minnesota House on the corner of Wabasha and 5th Street in the upper left-hand photograph. The Green Tree Saloon, operated by John Lunkenheimer on the corner of 4th and Wabasha, is in the center, and just to the left of it, the Post Office Saloon. A fun footnote, that was operated by Michael Esch in the 1850s. His son Daniel continued to operate in the saloon business on East 7th Street, and I just had his 4th great-grandson randomly appear in our beer garden last week. When he introduced himself and mentioned his name, I brought him into the saloon and showed him this map, these photographs. The red dots are actually on a map that hangs in our saloon. And we've had a wonderful dialogue over email, sharing the history of his great-great-grandparents' saloon operations, which were ultimately a 3-generation enterprise on different locations. At the bottom of the frame here, Francois Lebreche's, or Narcisse Lebreche's saloon on Minnesota Street. And what I want you to notice about each of these buildings, and what's important in terms of filling my brain and how we restore Waldmann, is just the delightful scale. You've got typically, in the case of the Green Tree and Narcisse Lebreche's saloon, a broad expanse of commercial glass on the first level, and up above, either with a false front or not, you see the 3 windows of the proprietor's residence on the second level. In the case of the Green Tree, you see the door that goes to a private staircase leading to the 2nd-story residence. I'm speaking about the photograph on the left-hand side of your screen in the middle, again, with the false front. If you see the broad expanse of commercial windows, to the right of those windows, you'll see a doorway that goes undoubtedly to the residential quarters upstairs. And I want you to notice that that door is not symmetric with the window on the 2nd level. You've seen that before, and you'll see it again on the restored Waldmann facade. Well, we could wander all over the streets of 1850s St. Paul, as actually a pharmacist did in the spring of 1852, when he came with his sketch pad and drew some delightful photographs of some commercial establishments that the Victorians don't often memorialize in photography, including the LaBelle Saloon on Bench Street. Here you see a photograph of the same saloon in 1856, a photograph that only exists. Again, the Victorians would never photograph a saloon in this era, but to the left is the state's first temporary legislative building. The saloon appears in the far right, and I've just super enlarged it so you can see it. The yellow circle shows you Bench Street, where this saloon was located, one of the toughest places in town, reputedly. The boatmen would gather here. There was billiards, licensed to have billiards, but there were plenty of other things in the offing. A sporting house, as described in the pen and ink drawing, is a euphemism in the 19th century for a house of prostitution. Cap Hawley and Old Swiss are operating the saloon at this point in time. The next generation of owners, the proprietor is actually a black man who has the reputation of being able to handle the ruffians pretty well. In a Pioneer and Democrat article of 1858, he's described as actually tossing two of them out those windows at the same time, one in each hand. The stories that go with these establishments are just wonderful. While I'm on stories, the same sketch artist paints the Jam Saloon on the bottom left-hand side. And you'll note his commentary here, kept by Monty, a one-legged veteran of the Mexican War. You just gotta love the stories that come out of this kind of research. When you look into Monty, it's Monty Ferdinand, and you see on the map where the Jam Saloon was located. Monty Ferdinand, in fact, was a veteran of the Mexican-American War. When you read this kind of description, a one-legged veteran, you kind of think of maybe a grizzled old guy with a peg leg in his 60s or 70s standing behind the bar telling stories. Well, in 1852, when this sketch was drawn and the reference was made, Monty was 26. He'd already had his leg amputated in the field in the Battle of Veracruz and received a payment from the federal government. That's how I learned of his life story. That's probably the capital he used to travel to Minnesota Territory and start the saloon that he began in 1851. I could go on, but you get the picture. Plenty of stories. Unfortunately, no stories of that color, at least, survive about Waldmann. Here we are in Waldmann's block, then named Forbes, now renamed Smith Avenue. If you notice the red lines I've drawn across this section of the Prince map, the top red line going from east to west roughly, or at least right to left, is the future West 7th Street. I say future West 7th Street because when Waldmann selects this site, West 7th doesn't exist. It becomes known initially as the Fort Road Extension. It's platted in 1860. Waldmann chooses Forbes Street for a different reason. Forbes is actually the feeder, it turns out, for the old Bluff Road, which wends its way along the bluffs of the Mississippi, ultimately to the Fort Snelling Landing. And why is that significant? Not because anyone wanted to go to Fort Snelling in 1857 when Waldmann set up shop. Fort Snelling was a sheep pasture at that time. They were going to the ferry where you could cross both the Mississippi and the Minnesota River in the most efficient manner if you were heading in stagecoach or by other means to part southwest Carver County, Shakopee, and beyond. So Waldmann would have had stagecoach travel coming down Forbes. He would have had pedestrian travel. Recall from the earlier view of the Prince map, it's also not far from the Bluff line, where the same year he set up shop in 1867, more than 960 steamboats whistle stopped or landed at either the upper landing or the lower landing of St. Paul. That was literally the high water mark, pun intended, of the steamboat industry on the Mississippi, 1857. And so those disembarking, particularly at the upper landing, only a quarter mile from Waldmann Saloon, would have found refreshment there. You notice on the photograph, the color photograph to the right of your screen, Alexander Erb's Saloon. If you come to Waldmann today, you'll probably pass this building because it's still there. It's at the corner of Smith Avenue and McBowl Street, easily viewed from West 7th. If you've ever had a beer at Bad Weather Brewery just across the alley from us, you'll see the back of this building. It was actually moved to that site in 1892. Its original location is shown by the arrow and red dot, not coincidentally, on the site of the then newly developed Fort Road. The Alexander Erb Saloon was initially established right on Fort Road and then moved subsequently to where my cursor is touching here, square one of block 9 of Leach's Addition, just to the north of Waldmann Saloon. So What else do you notice about the Alexander Herb Saloon in this photograph, which is today just housing? You see that same asymmetric door? It's gotten to be a bit of a parlor game with me to drive around the city and look for asymmetric doors on three-bay window or three-bay facades. Again, the Herb Saloon had the standard glass commercial facade. I've been on the inside of this house. You can see the line in the plaster work where, just like with Waldmann Saloon, with the Alexander Herb Saloon, the original saloon facade was filled in many, many decades ago. This is an 1874 map of the city. And this can be a little disorienting for those of you not intimately familiar with the city, but again, I'm circling with my cursor and I'm hoping you guys can see that action, Leach's edition here. And I'm pointing to Forbes Street right here, where it comes down and ultimately connects with what became known as Stewart Avenue. Stewart Avenue on this map is running directly beneath Fort Road, now known as West 7th Street, but that Stewart Avenue is in fact the top of the Mississippi River bluff. That's the vestigial pathway to Fort Snelling, probably a much earlier native pathway, but that was the road that Waldmann situated the saloon on originally. Waldmann is one of the last vestigial markers of that original old Fort Road. He makes no sense where he is today, but he made an awful lot of sense along this bluff line that you see here in this 1861 etching of the city, unfortunately shown just to the right of Waldmann Saloon. And why do I show you an early photograph that I recently acquired on eBay that I don't think many people have seen? I've shared a copy of this with the Stallman family who still live in the Twin Cities. This is the Stallman Brewery in 1870. The Stallman Brewery, which became the Schmidt Brewery in 1887, when all of the Stallman sons died in the same 5-year time period of various natural and unnatural causes, and Jacob Schmidt bought the concern, changing the name forever. But in fact, if you look at the property records, and in particular the abstract of Waldmann Saloon, you see a curious loan recorded on his abstract. It's actually a loan and a promissory note running from Anton Waldmann to Christoph and Wilhelm Stallman in the amount of $500. And the promissory note is canceled 18 months later. The money ran from Waldmann to the Stallmans. At the same time period that the Stallman Brewery was just beginning to build itself into the largest brewing concern in the upper Midwest, second only to the Pabst Brewery in Milwaukee in its day. So Waldmann Saloon literally provided a big chunk of the seed capital, and by the way, took a mortgage for the property underlying this building, which was only released 18 months later when Stallman's paid up. I actually kiddingly said to Adam Smith, the fourth great-grandson of Christoph Stallman, that I wasn't quite sure the note had ever been canceled, and I have a $500 Monopoly bill that Adam gave me at a party recently in payment of that debt. He and Rachel actually were married at Waldmann. We had the ceremony here in our beer garden a year and a half ago. So the connections between the Stallman Brewery, such as it remains, and the Waldmann concern continue to this day. Fun history. Well, so how else can you do research? You can dig in the ground just as much as you can dig in the libraries and the records offices, and we certainly did that. We had some wonderful volunteers from the Institute for Minnesota Archaeology, as well as some other volunteer archaeologists. Mead and Hunt get a big shout out. Connection that Bob Frame made for us. Thank you, Bob. And here you see some of the artifacts that came out of that. Mostly, so let me just give you the thumbnail sketch. The Waldmanns operate the saloon from 1857 to sometime in 1863, perhaps early 1864. The saloon closes mysteriously during the Civil War, and Waldmann reemerges, in fact, as a grain merchant. That history had been known prior to my research, but that had been the only connection made with Waldmann as a grain merchant. He operated on Fort Street for 5 or 6 more years, and then he retires seemingly to be essentially a landlord as he develops the remainder of his property facing Smith Avenue, introducing those 2 other houses I alluded to in one of the earlier slides. So the Waldmann history on this site has only got 6 years of saloon, about 30 years as residents, and certainly after the Waldmanns leave the site, well, you wouldn't know this, I shouldn't say certainly. In 1886, they emigrate back to Germany. They have no descendants in the United States. An absentee landlord by the name of Thomas Patterson purchases the property, subdivides it into 4 separate parcels, and you have over 130 years of absentee landlordism until Frances Drayling purchases the property in 1947, the woman that passed away, precipitating my purchase in 2008. There you have the thumbnail. The point of all of this, though, is of these artifacts, and I highlight the saloon related, the tavern pipe, the ink well. By the way, lots of ink well and writing related implements found in saloons because it's typically a place where the literate sell their skills to the illiterate for writing letters, legal documents, all sorts of things. The bucket of blood dig demonstrated that better than anything else. On the upper right-hand side, I'm not sure if my face is obscuring this object, unfortunately, and my apologies if it is on your screen as it is on mine, but you should be seeing a Civil War era saloon token, a value of 5 cents, which would have bought you 2 10-ounce glasses of German lager beer until about 1875. The other thing we find in a broader historical context, why is this man wielding a chair at his family? There's a sad history to saloons, not just in St. Paul, but across the country, because in this era, I find in my research, we are a nation of drunkards, which is in fact the title of the book this illustration comes from. In the 1850s, it was far cheaper to transport distilled spirits than it was raw commodities such as barley, such as corn. And so you have a distillation industry that has gone wild and levels of consumption that are 4 times the per capita rate of alcohol consumption today. Huge social problem that's viewed through a moralistic and religious lens in the era. This comes from a temperance pamphlet calling for the abolition of alcohol. In that era, it's called the temperance movement. A generation and a half later, it becomes the prohibition movement. But what happens when the Germans bring their lager beer to America? I'm not saying they're the sole reason this chart precipitously descends to today's level of alcohol consumption, but they are a major reason, together with, among other things, water purity and sanitation practices that allow people to actually consume water safely without adding alcohol or other sanitizers, in essence. You have a cultural shift and a growing popularity of beer as opposed to distilled spirits. And German lager is the #1 beverage in the United States by about 1880, second only to water. I mean, it basically takes over in popularity the brandy, the whiskey, the distilled spirits that had created huge social issues in the 19th century. And so what I learned from this is the fact that German saloons were places where families gathered, where political debates were held, where, as in this advertisement, Civil War recruits were mustered in this case, sharpshooters for the Minnesota 5th Infantry. They're places where the abolition movement is running strong. Remember, among the pallbearers of Lincoln's casket, there were 2 Germans, including Karl Schurz, among the most staunchest proponents of abolition, together, obviously, with Frederick Douglass and others. So that is all the history and the research that informs my headset as to what Waldmann was and what Waldmann could be, because if you notice, a lot of those themes resonate to today. The popularity of craft beer, the growing trend of lager beer among the craft beer brewers in the United States. Lager beer is coming back in a big way. The need to get away from beer-only establishments and combining food, as lager beer saloons originally did. It wasn't a coincidence that we chose to collaborate with Ramsey County Historical Society, Historic St. Paul, and other organizations in bringing in speakers. Because you know what? That's exactly what happened in German lager saloons in the 1850s and 60s. These were establishments for the cultured, where music was premiered, where debates were held, where civic ideas were exchanged. And so all of that went into the design of Waldmann as it is today. And as I told you, we've got musicians on the beer garden right now to prove it. If that's our history, how do we continue to leverage that history? Because that's my second do. Leverage your history. Well, when you find things like this in the archaeology in your own backyard, how do you not use this? It became very apparent as we began the course of reopening Waldmann Saloon that history was our greatest asset on our balance sheet. You can't make up this authenticity. You can see stuff like this hanging on the wall at TGI Fridays, and other places can fake history. But we had history. It was real. And we were reopening the very same business model that Waldmann had operated. Here you see a restored stencil cut in bronze by hand with a tin snip, likely, that was found crumpled up in a ball at the bottom of one of the 5 privies that were excavated during the construction on the site. Waldmann would have originally had a multiple of these, likely different sizes, possibly with different kinds of brands. This is the most simple. His was a humble establishment. If you were to look at the Pillsbury flower stencil, it's incredible. It must have taken the artist weeks to clip out all of the calligraphy and the flower embellishments, but a humble saloon keeper like Waldmann's was much more simple. How do you leverage that? You clean it up a little bit and you reuse it. This is our brand today. The font is a little bit sharper and a little cleaner, but it's the same lettering. And in fact, the name, most importantly, is the same. The classic W, where did those flames come from at the top of the W? You know what kind of lighting ultimately or originally likely was present at Waldmann? We know it wasn't kerosene because oil isn't discovered in Titus, Pennsylvania until 1867. It's either wax or beef tallow-based lighting, or more likely, whale oil lamps. And whale oil lamps of the era have a very characteristic font. It's a dual font because the lumens given off by flames a certain distance apart is a multiple of either of the flames individually. It's like 1 + 1 = 5 in lumens. So again, if you look at our brand, the W with the flames, not everyone is going to notice that, but people are delighted to pick it out when they're shown it. And if you come into Waldmann today, I hope your host or your server will go through the ritual I preach to them constantly of lighting the whale oil lamp on the table, and whether you're interested or not in its history, at least it might provide the opportunity for that conversation. Nobody's caught on fire yet. And by the way, they burn paraffin wax. No whales are injured in this project. Well, how else do you leverage it? You do some research on the food that was served in the era. Turns out it was fairly simple fare. A lot of what we call in fancy parlance today charcuterie, basically heavily salted preserved meats, cheeses, Limburger most famously, if you read the ads from the lager saloons from the era, pork knuckles, ox joints, all sorts of things which later became known as head cheese in the state of Wisconsin. We don't get too extreme with our fare today, but the feel and the simplicity and the honesty and the local sourcing of our fare is intended to replicate the fare Waldmann would likely have had in his saloon. If you notice the transferware plates that this food is presented on, I'm collecting and we are using transferware on the beer garden and in the house today. Not every plate comes from the era, but a lot of them do. Do's and don'ts number 3. And here, I don't mean to be mean, folks, but I have to say, don't assume the preservation bureaucracy is always going to help you. What do I mean by this? Well, originally, I blithely assumed that discovering the Twin Cities' only surviving Civil War saloon building might be viewed by the HPC and the State Historic Preservation Office as a good thing, as a thing worthy of support, as a thing worthy of lobbying. The city, mind you, there were a ton of regulatory hurdles to get through. This building sat on what by now had become a residentially zoned parcel. It is in a neighborhood, although originally it was a mixed commercial. Actually, I would posit it still is today a mixed commercial residential neighborhood. But suffice it to say, this wasn't like opening a CVS pharmacy. This was not a standard cookie cutter development project for the city to handle. Now, if you look at this slide, what it tells you is St. Paul as a leader, that St. Paul wants to be a leader in the use of best practices towards an equitable and sustainable approach in the conservation, preservation, and rehabilitation of historic structures. And notice the photographs used to illustrate this point. They're the photographs of the Hope Fire Engine Company #1 on Leach Street, #1 Leach Street, which actually was threatened with demolition 3 years ago. You see the crowd standing outside in the color picture. I'm actually speaking to the crowd because I'm the lawyer that sued the developer to preserve this building. The city had nothing to do with the preservation of the building. And in fact, the HPC was highly reticent to get involved in the fight. We had to pull together a collaboration of 5 different neighborhood organizations to bring the suit, to get standing with the court and get the temporary restraining order, which literally stopped the wrecking ball as they were wetting the brick to keep the dust from the wreckage from settling on the neighborhood. It was ultimately through the good stewardship of Councilmember Naker and some funds found to appease the developer and placing their parking lot somewhere else that the lawsuit was resolved. But my point here is oftentimes the city tends to take credit rather than initiative in preservation projects. And I found that to be the case in Waldmann as well. The first thing I did when I discovered the zoning issue was contact my city council member and say, Dave Thune, we got a problem here. The city of Minneapolis and a number of other cities have something called a historic use variance that allows historic structures that are designated as historic to be used for their original purposes or for some other purpose that keeps them viable. St. Paul doesn't. And Dave said, great, Tom, I love that idea. You draft it, we'll get it through. Well, famous first words, I did draft the ordinance. It took 3 years to get it through. Only after the city hired a consultant to study the issue, which was a well-settled proposition. State statutes permitted the ordinance. Other cities across the country provided the template for the ordinance. I actually drafted the ordinance, but it was a long wait to get this through. And here you see the section of the Preservation Code in Article 73 where our historic use variance process was finally ensconced in the city code. Drafted in such a narrow way that Waldmann was virtually the only project at the time that could ever qualify. But unfortunately, drafted in a way that required me to go through 5 separate public hearings before we could get the project through the hoop. Hearings which took months and ultimately years to get through, and hearings which were all predicated on, of course, my having a historically designated structure. Because Waldmann, the building, had never been designated. It was proposed for designation. It was listed on the Ramsey County Historic Site Survey, but nobody had ever bothered to actually do the homework and submit the paperwork to do the designation. And when I approached the HPC at the time, they had little interest in doing so. They lacked the funding. There wasn't the political impetus. It was potentially perceived as controversial for reasons I didn't understand. It's just a historic building. But ultimately, through a long series of very tense meetings, which grew even tenser when HPC discovered what I was intending to do with Waldmann's original saloon, i.e. reopen it, it was agreed that HPC would consider designation if I were to do the work and if the designation encompassed not just Waldmann, but every surviving pioneer era limestone building in the city of St. Paul. What you see on this screen is my attempt to dig into that project, now having invested tens of thousands of dollars already in Waldmann, trying to get the door open ultimately, and knowing that the entire project hinges on my ability to get HPC to designate it as a historic structure so that I can get it through my own historic use variance ordinance, which the city is still dilly-dallying to try to get enacted. If I sound like I'm complaining, I'm sorry, but this was a very worrisome period in my life. This faced a great deal of bureaucratic opposition, but absolutely no opposition from the higher ups. While I'm going through this process with the HPC, which I had felt would be the advocate for the project and turned out to be the obstacle, the mayor is telling me privately, Tom, keep on pushing. We'll have to make sure this project works. I want this project to work. And that I found to be extremely encouraging. Dave Thune was an incredible steward for the project as well. But in any event, I'm torturing away here, surveying 77 limestone buildings. You're seeing only page 1 of my Excel spreadsheet. At one point, it was suggested that perhaps I should encompass not just structures, but also, not just commercial and residential buildings, but also structures like limestone walls in the city. But in the final analysis, HPC decided that maybe it was enough if I just did the designation of 5 historic sites, one of them being Waldmann. And this actually worked much better because in point of fact, the amount of restoration work we were doing at Waldmann was beginning to test HPC and the State Historic Preservation Office's tolerance for alterations to a historic structure. I had done an awful lot of research, but there weren't any photographs. There wasn't any concrete evidence of the sort at least SHPO wanted to see and HPC wanted to see that supported the kinds of physical restoration we were doing. And so in a way, to be left with a 5-site composite designation enabled us to gain confidence that at least in aggregate, this thing could get through the hoop, even if in isolation, Waldmann created some controversy. And just another point on that, SHPO actually took the position that Waldmann was not historically significant as a saloon, but was more historically significant as a residence, since at least from a temporal standpoint, it had been used as a residence for longer than it had been used as a saloon. Now, we can have lots of academic debates about whether or not the period of significance should be drawn purely by the number of years in your basket, as opposed to other factors, qualitative factors, the rarity of the Twin Cities' only surviving Civil War saloon, as opposed to one of literally hundreds Civil War era residences. You can tell where I fall in that debate, but luckily I was the property owner and I got to define the project in the direction the restoration took. But my stance on it didn't lessen the controversy much. Well, enough of my belly aching about the preservation bureaucracy. Ultimately, in fact, we got both the ordinance through City Council, the designation through HPC and City Council. And since then, several other historic projects have utilized that same historic use variance process, which I find very gratifying. And ultimately, HPC, I think, has come to see its own wisdom in approving this project. And I'm proud to say they've had several gatherings at our beer garden, which has been wonderful. And I just want to emphasize the individual commissioners that have served dutifully on that body don't have easy jobs. These projects do come sometimes with political controversy. And when you're the landowner focused like a laser on getting your project through the HPC, you have a very different perspective than when you're sitting at a chartered body that has a responsibility to make sure that certain written standards are adhered to uniformly without bias or favoritism, and not just because Tom Schroeder is sitting in front of them, but in a way that is equitable. I fully acknowledge that, and ultimately, guys, you made the right decision. Another do engage the community, because I never would have gotten through that process without the help of these people and about 60 others. In the final of those 5 public hearings, we had over 60 attendees at the city council, not because it was that white knuckled, but because we had garnered tremendous community support throughout all of these public hearings. And we made a point of keeping the community informed as to what we were doing, the pace we were doing at, how it might affect the community at large, and what our true intent was, which was really to create a gateway project for the community of Uppertown, highlighting one of its, I believe, one of its most important and rare assets. And we had supporters not just in a advocacy sense, but in a monetary sense as well. We had a Kickstarter towards the end. The names on this wall show all the contributors of a certain sum and above to the project. There were many in addition to these who couldn't fit on the wall. You see Waldmann's face in the backdrop. But the Kickstarter allowed us to reach out to an even broader community, not just in St. Paul, but across the state, indeed the country. We had support and kind emails flowing in from Denmark and Australia. It was really incredibly heartwarming. And it led to a tremendous celebration on opening day, October 1st of 2017. We're now approaching our 4th year of operation. Do and don't. Number 5, it's a do the restoration right. It's not worth doing at all if you don't do it right. And you've already heard me describe there were different interpretations of what right was. Was right to make it a saloon as opposed to a remodeled apartment or house as it served for so many decades after the Waldmann era? Well, again, you know where I come out on that. To me, the restoration, doing it right, meant piecing together all of that documentary and archaeological research together with some what I would call vertical archaeology, paying very close attention to the traces of information found within the building as we're doing interior and exterior demolition and exploration. Understanding how the building was originally constructed, noticing where the original beams and posts supported that second story of stone coursing. We were able to nail the position of the original front entrance of Waldmann Saloon exactly because we found the post and beam markings and the square nails that secured them. The surface of the window glass that you see in the restored facade to the right, that plane was established by shadow marks on the side of the limestone. As you see the man scaling the scaffold in the far left picture, the edging of that stonework showed where the original casement of that window was, and we nailed it in the restoration. The 9 light windows, we don't know for certain, but we have myriad photographs of similar pre-Victorian commercial establishments of this scale that have 9 pane glass nearly identical to this. And the mutts in that glass were taken off a reading of the mutts in a window pane across the street at the Avery Adams house, which dates to 1854. So again, a lot of careful attention paid to detail, doing the restoration right. Here you see a part of the work which is not restoration, but which is a new addition in the back lot. It's what we call euphemistically our brew barn. It's where the commercial brewery is positioned. where our commercial kitchen and the restroom and all of the HVAC and all of the modern stuff that you wouldn't want to stuff in an 1850s building got put. But we did so in a way to not overshadow the historic structure on the forefront of the lot. And that was one of the things that HPC was concerned about too. By the way, the height of those arborvitae were closely regulated and dictated by HPC in a second hearing before the body when we reopened the beer garden and had to do all 5 public hearings a second time. But today, as you look at Waldmann, a few more slides of the interior here, again, illustrating doing it right. This is the original saloon hall on the first level. You see the unfinished virgin white pine flooring with later generations of paint on the edges where they literally painted around carpeting, area carpeting, comically enough. Saloon chairs. These are sometimes called firehouse chairs, but they frequently were in saloons, including in steamboat salons of this time period. We have probably one of the largest collections of saloon chairs in the Twin Cities, if not in the state. The stove is not made up. There are burn marks on the floor in this room that demonstrate that a wood burning stove was here to warm the building. And in fact, there was no other form of heat in the building other than stoves centrally positioned in the rooms upstairs and downstairs. That's not a period restoration stove, happily. That's a Morso, and coincidentally, patented by the Queen of Denmark in 1857. Waldmann's picture hangs on the wall behind. In the upstairs, in our so-called buffalo room, more of the same in the furnishing. You see the lamps I mentioned, the whale oil lamps, and the buffalo, the namesake for the room, hangs on the back wall. Germans of this time period were, hunting was a big part of the culture, but Bismarck, as we call him, is also emblematic of the decimation of the herds that was occurring by this point. The last herd of bison to cross the Mississippi in a natural migration pattern occurred in 1856, I'm told, just a year before the saloon was built. So doing it right means wall hangings that are consistent with the time period, furnishings, the ambiance, the scale of these rooms. This building literally could not be reconstructed today because these rooms are simply not code compliant except as grandfathered in a historic structure. This is the so-called attic room on the second floor of Waldmann. So just delightful spaces. And so as you sit and you look at the campus, as it were, today, and this is almost literally today, this is May 29th, we had 2 separate weddings for Memorial Day weekend on our beer garden, and we'd set up a temporary tent there, the white tent you see at the left-hand part of the screen. You see the large brewery painting, the word brewing on the side of the brew barn. People would drive by constantly and say, "What is that place?" And I finally decided, you know, I'm going to tell them. But there is a historic precedent for commercial structures having very prominently painted on them names like office, brewery, mill house. The vendors that came with deliveries must have made the workers weary with asking, "Where's the mill house? How do I get to the office?" And so you'd see paintings on the side of commercial establishments. Stallman's has brewery painted on the side of one of its earlier brewery buildings. Similar font as what you see here. But this is what you see here today. And the last I'm going to leave you with is probably the most important, because while I've probably overshared my frustrations in the project and probably way overshared my fascination for the history of the saloon and saloons generally in the city of St. Paul and what they say about St. Paul's early development, most I think it's important just to be grateful to all of the people that make a project like this happen. This was not done by me alone by any stretch of the imagination. The research, the lobbying, the directional advice that I received at every step of the way, the neighbors that kept telling me, "Tom, this is going to happen. Don't lose faith." don't lose faith. We're going to be at that next public hearing. I've got neighbors that actually could have punched a card 10 times attending my public hearings. I'm incredibly grateful for all of that support throughout this time. And in kind of a philosophical sense, if you could call it that, you know, who gets to discover a Civil War era saloon in their backyard that no one else has identified or had the opportunity to dig into and explore? I mean, geez, this was like, I felt like a little kid doing this. It was a ton of fun. My wife would have a different perspective. but seriously, most of all, I think as whether you approach these projects as a academician, as a preservationist, as a developer, as a neighborhood advocate, whatever your perspective, it's most important just to understand how lucky you are to have as within your stewardship a historic structure, and not just a commercial structure. It could be the residence you live in and are restoring or have restored. It could be myriad other categories of structures, but we are all lucky to have in our hands these buildings, these traces of the past, and the opportunity to bring them alive again to another generation very vividly with Waldmann. So I'm going to hang it up with that, but I think we've got plenty of time for questions if I haven't lulled you to sleep or sent you off in fits of rage or other emotions. So Robin, can you help me with the, have we got any questions or comments in the chat? I see we've got 6. Where do
We've got several, and I will remind everybody, please feel free to put your questions and comments in the chat. And Jeannie had a question. Did you intend to buy the house next door from the start of your project where the beer garden is now?
No. Let me stop share here, and maybe I can see some of your faces. Maybe not. No, I mean, we originally acquired the stone building and the parcel it sat on, which was only 26 feet wide, not knowing it had been a saloon, wanting to save it from demolition, and thinking that perhaps we could restore it as an apartment. And then a few months later, we had the crazy idea that my wife's brother-in-law, who was then in luthier school, might be interested in maybe having his violin shop there. So we certainly didn't have any idea at the time of any grand development of a business that I would operate, much less a lager saloon, much less a licensed brewery. That came as I started to dig into the history, and really that light bulb turned most brightly when I found Waldmann Saloon license that I showed you.
So she had a follow-up question. Was the building moved for excavation or was it left in place when you were digging up the privies and so forth? I think that's what she's asking.
Sure. So the cottage that you saw just off to the left in one of my earlier photographs, that cottage was originally moved, it turns out, from the alley, facing the alley behind the Waldmann Saloon in 1892. It was constructed in 1876. It was moved to its current site in 1892, long after the Waldmanns had left, and it was moved there to permit sewer access. It was plopped down right on top of the saloon well, as it turned out. That was an accidental finding. There's a hole 55 feet deep in the center of the lot after we moved that house. But when I acquired that property, by then I knew that I wanted to stitch together the original Waldmann property, including where the beer garden would have sat. By the time I acquired that property, I was also working with Preservation Alliance with Minnesota for a solution for that structure. And we brokered a deal with the Preservation Alliance to place a facade easement on the structure. We developed architectural drawings of the structure in its restored condition, just to give a future developer a vision of what it could be. And I donated the house after purchasing the property. I donated the house to Preservation Alliance, and they worked with the developer to move it to, I believe the address is 47 Forbes Street. Now, remind you, Forbes used to be Smith, then it got renamed a couple of blocks up, at a street that used to be called Smith and is now Forbes. If that isn't confusing, nothing is. But so that house was fully rehabbed, and it was sold for $157,000 2 years later to its loving owner today.
So I'll get back to Brad's question. I'm not ignoring you. I'm just clumping them a little bit. Cynthia wanted to know what was the total cost of restoration? And then Donald wanted to know, was the second floor ever residential?
The second floor was residential. Let me start with that one. Clearly, and the floor plan on the second floor, there was a dividing wall in the second level, which we did remove to make it more usable for restaurant tap room space. You can see the line on the floor I left where the floor template was, or the floor plate was for that wall. But the upstairs was used by the Waldmans as residence. They appear in the residential directory on that address, so we know they lived there. They later in 1872 built the large Italianate on the south lot at the corner of Goodrich Street and then Forbes, now Smith, and literally moved across the grass in 1872, and from that point rented out the stone structure to other occupants until they left the country. In terms of the cost of restoration, again, I hope my wife isn't listening, but so we put just over $400,000 in the restoration of the building before we began the commercial development. And the commercial development was about 2.1 million. And that is for a lot of brewery equipment, a lot of restaurant equipment, a lot of furnishings, and a lot of above standard finishes on the interior. All of the interior woodwork is hand planed, most of it's square nailed. All the paint that you see in the interior is calcimine paint. On the exterior, it's linseed oil. The restoration expense was in part due to the fact that we use natural lime mortar, or at least a much softer mix. We did not use Portland concrete, what most other masons would use for tuck pointing today, because the structure was originally built with natural lime mortar. That came out of the research and the chemical testing as well. So Building Restoration Inc. gets the credit for the tuck pointing. And fun fact, they were working on the Federal Reserve building in St. Louis at the same time they were working on my little structure. So huge disparity in scale of projects at the time. But if you talk to the construction manager, he will tell you in all honesty that there were complexities here they did not face in St. Louis.
There are always unexpected complexities in these. Brad made a comment and a question. Do you feel that you broke new ground that others have been able to benefit? That is, do you feel the bureaucracy in quotes has been streamlined to achieve a more sensible and balanced approach to building restoration and establishing a business in the city of St. Paul? And if not, what do you think needs to be done to accomplish that?
Okay, so before I answer that, let me go back because I want to make one other really important point about the costs. You guys probably heard those dollar amounts and blanched, but what I want you to know and what's critical to understand is, you know what's paying for that? Waldmann is paying for that. So those are SBA loans and commercial bank loans, the carrying costs of which are being supported by the business that goes on here. So what's really exciting to me as a preservationist is, you know, it's one thing to stand in front of the wrecking ball, and I've done that on many occasions, oftentimes to no avail, but it's quite a more difficult challenge to actually come up with a reuse that makes a site like this commercially viable. And not only commercially viable, but we have anywhere between 35 to 45 unique visits annually, 35 to 45,000 unique visits annually, which I would wager makes Waldmann among the most visited historic sites in the city of St. Paul, with the exception of perhaps, well, definitely the fairgrounds and the state capitol probably, but few others. So what's really cool about those costs is they are being supported by the authenticity of the business. Now, back to the bureaucracy and has it changed? No, not at all. And I guess the disappointing thing to me is, so the historic use variance process has not been amended. Anyone else that tries to get through that spanking machine is going to have the same 2.5-year delay process I did, if they indeed have to go through the designation and all of the public hearings necessary. There are other hurdles I won't mention related to parking and code compliance, et cetera. But no, very, very little, if anything, has changed. What may have changed somewhat is at least we have a couple of good examples. The Presbyterian Church on Summit, Waldmann, a growing number of isolated examples where historic structures that have gone through the variance process have been made commercially viable in their new uses. But it's taken dogged, crazy owners to get through that process, and it shouldn't be that way. I mean, we do need a fundamental change from a preservation bureaucracy that was designed to stop things to a preservation, I don't know what you'd call it, an advocacy that searches for ways to create new opportunities from historic resources rather than viewing them as precious jewels that need to be held under glass and not touched. Because it's I don't think much has changed in that regard.
Are there any other questions right now? Well, we'll turn off the recording in a minute, but first of all, I want to thank Tom for sharing your project, your process, and all the research that you did. It's a fascinating story. And as Joe mentioned, future generations will benefit from the work. And I do want to urge everybody to not only check out Ramsey County Historical Society, but go to Waldmann's, see the beautiful space, and hopefully we will be able to start having programs with RCHS and Waldmann's together in the fall. But in the meantime, come visit the beautiful beer garden, have some lager, and see the inside of the building. So again, thank you all for being here, and we'll hope to see you at another program soon.